right. All right. So today we're here to talk about the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Grant Program and PennDOT's pre-grant announcement. Today, I'm Jamie Kopko, and we have the PennDOT team here to discuss information about the grant pre-announcement, as well as how to prepare for the notice of funding opportunity. A little bit of housekeeping, as you may have noticed already, because of the way we set up this meeting, we did not realize that it would require us to manually unmute and to allow you to turn on your camera. So we do apologize for that. But do want to let the group know that we are going to be hosting a formal Q&A session after the presentation, and we ask that you hold all questions until then. But if there is a question that you don't want to forget, by all means, or if there's something that someone's presenting, put that in the chat or raise your hand, and we will certainly try to ensure that we address that as soon as the Q&A session begins, or to unmute you so that you can ask. So from that, I would like to introduce PennDOT's IIJA coordinator, Natasha Fackler, to get us started today.
Thank you, Jamie. And before we start, I do see there's one comment about maybe temporarily unlifting the mute. So those who have their settings can turn on the volume or something differently and check that. So maybe if we can try that for a second. I don't know if there's a way to unmute everyone or not, Jamie, before we start.
I can look into it. Let me see what I can do.
All right. Maybe someone from my team, if you can type in the chat about this is being recorded for anyone who is having trouble hearing, they will be able to hear the recording as well. Someone can type that in the chat if they can't hear. All right, we are going to go ahead and get started though, and I want to thank everyone for joining us here today. As Jamie told you in the agenda, we are going to be walking through a lot of details, but the first thing I want to do is kind of a disclaimer. And really important to know that as we, Pennsylvania, are moving forward with our procurement and use of our NEVI funds, there are still some unanswered questions coming out from the federal government that we are waiting for. So if the federal government releases any additional NEVI guidelines, and when the proposed rulemaking becomes a final rulemaking, we will make sure that all of our contractual language and our final notice of funding opportunity has those details in it. So we are just putting that up front. Anything that we say today is kind of our plan, but it may change based on what comes out from the federal government. And so that's kind of our disclaimer here at the front of the presentation that we want to make sure everyone understands as we move forward. Next slide. Can I advance my slides? Oh, there you go. Thanks, Jamie. You can go ahead to my next one. So I wanted to start off by saying, with this historic level of funding for electric vehicle infrastructure coming from the federal government, it's important to note that this is not the first time in Pennsylvania that we are on the forefront regards to electricity. From Pennsylvania native Ben Franklin flying his kite in a thunderstorm to the city of Scranton being the first city in the United States to be electrified and have electric streetcars, Pennsylvania has a long history of being a national leader. Going forward, it is our hope that we can leverage this funding to continue that history of innovation. Next slide. So I want to give a quick high-level overview. Many of you have heard this presentation slide in other events, but we want to just go over kind of the background of the NEVI funding. So again, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program, it was funded through the bipartisan infrastructure law. We're almost up to the one-year anniversary of that passing of that bill. This bill did provide $171.5 million to Pennsylvania through the formula funds. In our first federal fiscal year 22, which actually is the one that just ended September 30th, we were granted $25.4 million. And in federal fiscal years 23 through 26, we will be receiving $36.5 million annually. As many of you remember, every single state was required to submit a NEVI plan to the federal government for use of these funds. And those plans were due by August 1st of this year. We submitted ours a few weeks early on July 21st, And we were one of the first 35 states to receive approval of our plan on September 14th of this year. All of the states, all 50 states, plus Puerto Rico and DC, received approval of their plans by the September 30th deadline. A few weeks ago, on October 12th, we released what we called the pre-announcement of our funding opportunity. There's a lot of information on our website right now from that pre-announcement, ways to start getting ready and things that we're going to talk about here in today's presentation. But we wanted to make sure as we are releasing this information for the funding opportunity that there's plenty of time for those who are interested in coming and in for this funding, that they can prepare their applications and the things they need to do, that is enough time to do that. So you all are here on our formal informational webinar, and it will be recorded and posted on our website afterwards. But we are planning right now to release our formal announcement in late December, early January timeframe. Next slide. So the NEVI state plan, again, really quick, it's a 5-year document, right? It's a 5-year vision with a 1-year strategy is kind of how we think of it. The plan is evolving as we move through the 5 years of this funding opportunity. Our plan will change and our use of those funds will evolve based on the criteria that we have to follow. The plan itself really took a deep dive looking at kind of what was our vision and goals for use of the funds, took an analysis of where there's funding infrastructure in place, where there's gaps along our corridors, key corridors, and how we intend to fill those gaps. Also, a full section that talks about key challenges that we will face as we roll out this funding and risks and ways that we hope to address those. Also, and a large portion of today's presentation will be on the contracting framework. The NEVI plan also has a section that really talks about our labor and workforce and ways that we can promote a healthy economy here in Pennsylvania with good, sustaining, payable jobs. And that really important to us is the engagement and equity principles. We have a full strategy that we have put together for getting out to all of our stakeholders and to our communities next spring. In the forefront of that is our equity principles that we released earlier this year in February. Next slide. So on this slide, we are showing you our electric vehicle alternative fuel corridors. And if you remember, the national NEVI goal is really for a convenient, reliable, affordable, and equitable charging experience for all users on the nationwide network. Initially, all of the funding that is directed through the NEVI program must go to the alternative fuel corridors that have been designated by the states. In Pennsylvania, we participated in over 6 rounds of all 6 rounds of the Alternative Fuel Corridor program and have designated our interstates and then portions of US 30, US 15, Route 1, and Route 422. So we have over 1,800 miles of roadway that are designated. Now, remembering that the nationwide goal is a consistent network across all states, we've shown you here on the map how we connect into some of the other alternative fuel corridors in our surrounding states. And you can see that that's important because no matter if you're traveling in Pennsylvania or to another state, we want to make sure that electric vehicle owners have the confidence that no matter where they're driving, they will have infrastructure in place to support their travel and mobility needs. Now, once the alternative fuel corridors are fully built out, and if you recall from our other presentations, a fully built out system is one that the stations are less than 50 miles apart from each other and within 1 mile of those interstate corridors. Once that build out has occurred on all 1,800 miles of our network, our AFC network, we then will have flexibility in the use of our funds. That flexibility then will allow us to put funding infrastructure in any public location and off any public roadway. So it's very important to keep that in mind that our #1 goal initially with the Alternative Fuel Corridor program is to build it out with our NEVI funds. Next slide. This slide is going to talk to you a little bit more about the funding. So I told you in federal fiscal year, the first one we have 25.4, and in federal fiscal year 23, which is the one that just kicked off here, 36.5 million. So if you kind of look at the bottom dark blue there, you see we're saying that we have approximately $56 million that we hope to initiate in our round 1 and 2 funding. So that is money that will be dedicated directly to filling out our alternative fuel corridors. Primarily, again, because the NEVI goal, the national NEVI goal, is to build out the interstate system. Our initial round will focus on the interstates that are designated as alternative fuel corridors. In round two, and we will go over the timeline, so don't worry. In round two of our funding, we will open it up then to all of our alternative fuel corridor locations. I will note the note on the bottom of the screen. While this is our full funding allocation, the $171 million, we are hoping to put some money aside for labor and workforce training, for planning, outreach, and program management of the NEVI funds. But a majority of the funding will go directly to building out the alternative fuel corridors, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Next slide. All right, so these two slides I'm going to show you, the eligible and ineligible cost on the next slide. These are from the federal NEVI guidelines. And so there's a lot of words on the slide, and we did that on purpose. Usually we don't have so many on the slide, but we did that so you could see all of the things that the federal government is saying that are eligible costs under the NEVI programs. And these are part of the NEVI guidelines. You can read through these on the federal website as well. One of the things that I wanted to note specifically on this one is about halfway down the slide, I think it's the 7th bullet. There is an eligibility to upgrade a current site to be NEVI compliant. So the NEVI rules do have some certain power requirements and also number of ports. It's 150 kilowatt minimum, 4 ports to be able to charge at 600 kilowatts simultaneously. And if you own a station currently that's within 1 mile of an interchange and you aren't NEVI compliant, you do have the eligibility to apply for this funding and be able to upgrade your site to be NEVI compliant to meet that power requirement and the port requirement. So just wanted to point that out as one of the things on this slide, but make sure you read through all the eligibility criteria in the NEVI guidelines as you're putting together your applications. Next slide. There's also a list of ineligible costs. The number one item on here is one I'd really like to highlight. Any cost that are incurred prior to grant award is ineligible. So we do have a full process that we must follow for use of federal funds, including having the projects on our TIP and STIP, that is our transportation plan that says what projects we are going to fund. And then the federal government does give us approval of our plan and use of funds. So those all have to happen prior to any funding being allocated or any expenses being reimbursed through this program. So that is the main thing I wanted to highlight on here. Also, number 2 is a big one, costs that are not directly related to the EV charging station itself. I know that there are some questions that might be answered further in the formal rulemaking from the federal government, but right now they're saying that anything that is a necessary component to connect to that EV charger is it has to be directly related to that station or that charging network to be an eligible expense. So just thinking through some of those items, again, anything that comes out in final rulemaking will have to be formalized as we move forward with our funding opportunity. Next slide. So the NEVI formula program does require a minimum of 20% match requirement from the proposer. 80% of that will be covered from the funding, from the NEVI funding itself, up to 80%. But we are saying in round 1, so that is our first initial round of funding that we are putting out directly related to building out the alternative fuel corridors on our interstates, that we, PennDOT, will only consider fixed operation and maintenance cost, the 5-year fixed networking and data cost, and 5-year fixed warranty cost that might be part of that. We are not going to be paying for any variable or covering the cost for any variable O&M costs, things like electricity, insurance, and any other business or staffing costs. So we wanted to say, point that out. In future rounds of funding, this may change, but in round 1, interstate AFCs, this is the guidelines that we are putting forth. Next slide. So as you think about your proposal, we wanted to share with you some of the criteria that we will be using as we evaluate the proposals that come in for use of this funds. So knowing that the number one goal of this formula fund is to build out that AFC, those alternative fuel corridors, we really are looking at location as a number one priority. So related to the site itself. We will be walking through our live map, interactive map here in a few slides. But right now, just understanding that the actual site location, the interchange itself is going to be very important in the evaluation criteria. We are also looking at the site's readiness. Is there power already at that site? What would be the cost to upgrade and prepare that site for the electrification? Understanding what is available at that site. Is it able to be future-proofed? Ways that we can prepare for additional chargers maybe at that location. Are we looking ahead to maybe medium duty use as well? Making sure that there is availability for larger sized vehicles to charge there, or pull through capability, things like that also will be considered in this evaluation of the site. Next slide. Additionally, in our selection and evaluation criteria, we have what we're calling the sustainability, equity, resiliency, economic development section of our evaluation. In this section, we are really looking at some different ways that we are supporting the economy here in the state, what jobs there might be for the local community, ways that we can involve small and diverse businesses in that funding opportunity. What ways has the proposer looked at public engagement in their community and talking about the need for electrification there? We also will be looking at, is there any renewable or clean energy sources being discussed as well as part of the installation? And then the third priority is related to cost. And we will be looking at the overall cost of the project and how much the proposer is willing to put up for the match. Again, remembering it's a minimum of 20%. Also looking at the overall cost of the infrastructure that's being proposed and how much or what all is involved in that project. I will say again that this is all subject to change as we finalize our notice of funding opportunity that we will be issuing later this year. So this is our high level thinking now. As we finalize that procurement and have all of our reviews, it is subject to change. Next slide. And speaking of subject to change, so we put a few slides in here. We want to just remind everyone about the proposed rulemaking that is in front of the federal government. So earlier this year in June, the federal government released their minimum standards guidelines, and it really went through a whole host of sections related to the charging infrastructure, some things related to reporting, and the federal government received over 383 public comments. So that means individuals or businesses or state DOTs that replied to that funding to that proposed rulemaking. So from that, the federal government now is combing through those questions to make their final rulemaking. If you go to my next slide, while this did close in August, we are awaiting the final guidance to come out from them, but we took a key look at those proposed rules. And there's some that really relate to PennDOT and the work that we must do. And then on my next slide, I'm going to talk through some that relate specifically to those who want to have sites or interested in installing this equipment. So from our perspective, some of the key things in the proposed rulemaking is transparency on our process, the procurement process. That's why we're hosting webinars like the one we are today. We do have a full NEVI website developed as well, where we are putting forth all of our information publicly. The state is required, this second bullet is one I really want to talk about. The state is required to do not only an annual report, but quarterly reporting on the use of the EV infrastructure. And this is something that, while it's the DOT's responsibility in the proposed rulemaking to submit, that we would need from anyone who installs charging infrastructure with this funding, is really understanding all of those details and reporting requirements. The state is also required to put together a full community engagement report. That is something we are actively working on, and we keep track of all of our public speaking engagements And we have a full strategy on how we are going to roll that out, but that is something that is required currently in the proposed rulemaking. We also have some things related to use of the funds, making sure that there's a reasonable return of investment eligible for the private investors. Again, the federal government hasn't said what a reasonable return of investment is, so we're waiting to see if there's any further clarification on that. And then our technicians, if they have to be certified as EVITP or similar, that is something we're waiting to hear from the final rulemaking. Next slide. In the proposed rulemaking, there also is some key things that EVSE owners or site hosts should be aware of, and these are really related specifically to the charging infrastructure and some of the rules related to the data sharing, the uptime, the communication. So again, just making sure when this final rulemaking does come out from the federal government, that anyone eligible for anyone who applies for and receives use of this funding will need to make sure they follow any of the final rulemaking. Next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about this anticipated time frame, and we kind of put together a little roadmap here for you. We are planning to do our formal announcement in mid to late December time frame, with it being open for approximately 3 months. With the applications due in the March timeframe. We would hope to do conditional awards in the mid-May time period, with final award going out in July. If you remember again from one of the previous slides that we would release a second round of funding, we do hope in the July time period, as we're announcing awards from the first round, that we would open up the second round of funding. That second round of funding will continue to build out our alternative fuel corridors and to fill in any additional gaps that were not filled during round 1 funding. We do know that it will take time to plan for and install this EV charging infrastructure, anywhere from 6 months to 12 months to 18 months time. I think it will all be dependent on many factors. But as we think about that installation timeline, the O&M portion of that, what a proposed or an actual site host will then be required is 5 years of operation and maintenance that is required to as part of the NEVI guidelines, that the station will have to be operational for a minimum of 5 years if they've received NEVI funds. So that's just, this timeline is kind of showing you an overall structure of what that could look like. Next slide. All right, I'm going to be turning it over to Jamie Kopko for a little bit.
Hello, everybody. So essentially what we wanted to do is, as I know I've seen a few chats coming up about, where is this information going to be posted in regard to this webinar? But also, as the team has mentioned, we have a lot of information already available. So just wanted to do a quick demonstration of our current website so that you know how to navigate it to find the NEVI information, but specifically the apply for NEVI funds information. So we have the link in the slide. However, we do have a vanity URL. So if you just type in PennDOT.pa.gov/EV, you will land at this main page. And of course, on that side navigation, you're just going to select the NEVI program. So here, there's a lot of opportunity and options in terms of information. And of course, in regard to what we're talking about today, you're going to want to select the Apply for NEVI Funds. The Apply for NEVI Funds page has a lot of great information, and this is where you can get the details in regard to our eligible entities, projects, costs, as well as ineligible costs, selection criteria, and within that selection criteria, the site-related sustainability, equity, resilience, economic development costs, the items that Natasha actually just briefly went over. So I'll scroll just briefly, but I know that scrolling on a webinar can hurt everyone's eyes. So I do encourage the group to definitely visit this site, and we can include the link in the chat as well. So I can do that momentarily. But also want to highlight the how to get ready. So Andrew will be speaking on this in a lot more depth shortly. However, I just wanted to highlight that this does include a few of the steps. And so you're already halfway there by already attending this webinar. However, I wanted, oh, actually it is there now. So I wanted to let the group know that we've been working with our utility partners, and they have graciously provided some information about how best to coordinate with them and their teams. And so we have this helpful information about their contacts and how to coordinate with them, their processes on this PDF. So we'll continue to build out this site. Just want to make it clear to the group that as we're building out information on how to get ready, that we'll include it here. In regard to this particular presentation, we will also add it here, but it will also be placed under the Learn About the NEVI page. And so just kind of reiterating that from this perspective, you can learn about all of our upcoming sessions. And then at the bottom is where we will actually be adding all of our previous recordings, including this recording, as well as the slide deck. And appendices will include the utility coordination there from that perspective. I also just want to point out that we do have an FAQ page that's pretty robust. And so by all means, we encourage the team to, look through this and, let us know by emailing the team, actually, which is a nice little button here, if you have any recommendations on additional FAQs that we can add, because we do want to keep this an updated and helpful FAQ component for you. But the most important part of this entire sort of subsite is the priority project locations. So this information provides how we're proceeding with round 1 funding, but it does also define the priority 1, 2, and 3 groups. And it also links to our NEVI round 1 interchange information mapping tool. And with that, I'm actually going to be handing this off to Jonathan Reel to do a demonstration of the mapping tool so that you can understand how to utilize it.
All right, thank you, everyone. So as you can see here, I've clicked on the link that Jamie just showed, and some of you are probably pretty familiar with this already, the map here, but what I wanted to do is just take a few minutes to go through and show you some of the details here about what you'll see and how to click through the map if you have questions. So when you open up the map, by default, it's just going to show you one corridor, which is Interstate 80. We've set the corridors, which are shown in purple on here, as Natasha showed previously. Each corridor has a group of priority circles. I'm getting a little bit of feedback. If others could mute there, thank you. So each one of these ovals will show you what the priority level is. If you want more information on all those levels and what that is, you can click down here and it'll jump back to the page Jamie just showed you. So you can see here all the groups. If you were interested in a particular interchange, you could zoom in and take a look at that. Before I do that, I wanted to just highlight a couple of the items in the legend. So for the AFCs, you could see the round 1 corridors are shown in purple. The round 2 corridors are shown in pink. The bordering corridors here are shown in a red color so that you could see going into the other states. And that becomes important if you're interested in putting infrastructure near the border and you want to know where other states are with their corridors. So we also have on there, you can add in the compliant NEVI chargers, and you can look where there already are compliant chargers across the state, where there's planned ones that are already spec'd out to be NEVI compliant that are going to be installed, and then the ones operating out of state. For instance, the one here in Youngstown on Interstate 80, that one's there, so you can kind of see how far that would take you into Pennsylvania for the 50-mile requirement. And you can turn those on and off by using the I buttons over here. You could turn on and off the alternative fuel corridors. And right now I mentioned Interstate 80 is being shown. You can click on the arrow here and you can actually show any of the corridors you're interested in. Like I said, Interstate 80 is currently shown. You could switch to 79 if you want. I'll go back to 80 here and zoom in. So as you zoom in, you're going to see the interchanges. The interchanges are labeled and they're colored either green or gray. Green would be an eligible interchange, gray would be ineligible. The primary reasons they'd be ineligible are if it's a high-speed interchange, for instance, Interstate 80 and 79, There's nothing within a mile that could be located there that would count towards the program. There's also interchanges that are unidirectional, so there might be only one in a given direction, and we're trying to avoid those interchanges as well, so that we have interchanges where a traveler going either direction could jump off and use the charger. So you'll notice most of them are green. If you zoom in on them, we've added recently the polygons, the 1 mile polygons here, so that you could see where you might want to do an install. I'll just give you an example one here. So exit 29 off of Interstate 80, you could see here where your business lies or where your interests lie in putting in a charger and see if you're within the 1 mile. These were vetted by our team and are pretty solid, but there are cases where obviously if you're right on a border or something like that and you're wondering if you should apply or not, you could certainly submit a question and we could look into it in further detail to verify and ensure that you'd be eligible if you were worried about that. And that's pretty much it for these. You can just go through at your leisure here and look at what you'd like and zoom around. I do recommend you use this on a computer and not on a phone because of the size of the site. I'll just quickly show you a couple others here. For instance, Interstate 81, you could come and zoom in and see, take a look at those and the polygons. Some of the polygons are going to overlap, and that just means you would get credit at either interchange. If you're curious when there is an overlapping polygon, most of the map is not clickable, but the polygons are. So you should be able to click on the polygon and you would see that exit 45, what it covers. It shows you the full polygon there. We also have, for those of you interested in the shape files, there's a download GIS data button that we've added that has all of the up-to-date shape files included. If you'd like to get access to those so that you can open it in your favorite GIS platform and work on it there. I mentioned the submit a question button if you're curious or have any other questions on that. I'm going to leave it at that for now. And if there are other questions, we can either take them during the Q&A. You could submit a question here, however you prefer. And I'm going to give back my screen control and we'll switch over to Andrew, who will show you a little bit about getting prepared.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks, Jamie and Natasha, for the great information shared so far. So we're going to dig in a little further to how to get prepared to apply for the NEVI program. So on the next slide, you'll see information on the different key steps to take to prepare. Again, as Jamie just mentioned, all of this information will be posted from both today's webinar and a number of other resources available on the website, but we're going to walk you through some key steps right now. So this is basically the agenda of the different points we're going to cover in how to get ready. So on the next slide, we'll discuss how to register for Keystone. You need to develop a login for this Pennsylvania Keystone site. The application for PennDOT's NEVI funds will be an online portal application. And so this registration will allow you to have a profile on that site and be prepared to submit a digital application through PennDOT's portal. So you can see here the URL that will take you directly to this page that you see on the right-hand side. You'll click that register button, and really all you'll need is some personal information: first name, last name, date of birth, your email and mobile phone for contact information, and you will set up a username and password and security questions. And so this will prepare you so that you have a full login and are able to apply online when the RFP or the NOFO posts in Pennsylvania. So beyond developing this login for yourself, and I saw a hand up, we'll address some specific questions about this in the Q&A section. But beyond developing this login, if we jump to the next slide, a key thing, and we've discussed a lot of this information today, is to familiarize yourself with the NEVI program, particularly the Pennsylvania NEVI plan, the federal guidance. Natasha touched on a lot of it, but you can read it in detail and know what you will actually be required to perform. There's federal frequently asked questions and the proposed rulemaking that Natasha discussed. All of this has links out from the PennDOT site that Jamie showed you. And as we'll discuss throughout this section, PennDOT is working hard to build out that site with additional information that we'll touch on in the next couple slides. So jump into the next slide. This is obviously a virtual webinar, but PennDOT is partnering with the Clean Cities coalitions in the state and other stakeholders to host 4 upcoming stakeholder events in person. You can see the dates there: November 3rd, 10th, 15th, and 22nd. So beyond this virtual event, there's going to be 4 opportunities to attend a regional in-person session and network directly with PennDOT staff, Clean Cities staff, and other stakeholders. So you can see here that link to register, and this is all on the PennDOT NEVI site. And if you have any further questions about these events, you can email the PA email there for additional questions. But these will be great opportunities, particularly to network in person, develop connections and better understanding beyond what we're presenting here virtually. So on the next slide, the big part of developing a NEVI project is to develop a team. Pennsylvania is interested in projects that are ready to go, and that means both having a team together, hardware identified, and a site selected. So we're going to talk about all those things. But in terms of readiness, Natasha mentioned that the site and its readiness will be key parts of the scoring and evaluation criteria. So you want to identify sites, identify the contractors that you'll be working with to install at that site. Make sure that your team has the required certifications, particularly that there's at least one certified electrician with EVITP certification. You want to make sure you have your equipment supplier that's supplying the charging station hardware, and you know who your team's going to be that's going to operate and maintain it. In some cases, you may be working with a major company that provides all of these things as a turnkey service. In other cases, you may choose to go a la carte and piece a team together with each one of these as a different third party. Either way is available to you, but make sure you've got your whole team identified and the different roles being played, so that groundwork is laid and you have all those key components when you come time to put in an application. So beyond these kind of core team members, jumping to the next slide, if Clean Cities in each state are key team members or key resources to help you develop teams. Tony Bandiero with Eastern Pennsylvania Alliance for Clean Transportation and Richard Price for Pittsburgh Regional Clean Cities. Both are longtime Clean Cities coordinators with a wealth of experience. They have been working in the transportation electrification sector for a number of years. And if you need technical assistance, connections to industry partners, you name it, these are great resources that can help get you connected, and they will be partnering with PennDOT on these upcoming in-person stakeholder sessions as well. So these are great resources to you as prospective applicants who can help walk you through all the ins and outs of the process and assist where you may need it. Beyond the Clean Cities, there are additional things to get ready for on the next slide here. If we jump to the next slide, really we want to stress the importance of coordination. The biggest thing you can do to prepare is to start to coordinate with all the different third parties that you'll need to connect with in order to create a successful project and application. So in the scoring criteria that Natasha covered, there's information about coordination with your local planners and partners to make sure that you've engaged appropriately at those local levels. Your MPO or Metropolitan Planning Organization has all the different municipal governments as members and provides a lot of transportation planning services for the region. They are great resources. You'll need to connect with your local government. I'm obviously going clockwise here. Your local government is the one who will work with you and the utility on final permits and code and inspections at that local jurisdiction. So you're going to want to familiarize yourself with that local jurisdiction and that government's processes. Obviously, you're going to want to stay in touch with the Pennsylvania state agencies that are involved in this process, obviously DOT and DEP. You're going to want to connect with a local site host. If you're not that local site host in business, you're going to want to identify that site and business. We just mentioned the Clean Cities coalitions. And next, we're really going to be focusing on the utility companies. But beyond that, obviously, you need a network provider, a provider that's going to work with you to provide the charging station hardware and the networking and data services that are required by the NEVI program. So obviously, there's a lot of external parties to coordinate with and connect with, and it's best to identify as many of those as you can early, get those key points of contact and those relationships going, and that way when the notice of funding opportunity comes out from Pennsylvania, you'll have all the right connections and pieces in place to be able to apply most efficiently and effectively. So utilities are a key part of all this, and we're going to talk more about that on the upcoming slides. So if we jump to the next slide, based on the scoring criteria that Natasha mentioned, your site is one of the most key components in all of this. Your site must be NEVI compliant in terms of on an eligible alternative fuel corridor, within the every 50-mile distance from the next available charging station. It must be within those 1-mile polygons that Jonathan just illustrated on the map. It must have ADA accessibility and safety and a number of other minimum requirements required by the NEVI program. In addition to that, because these are federal highway aid funds from U.S. Department of Transportation, all sites must eventually attain NEPA environmental clearances. So you can get a head start on that by doing some due diligence to know that your site is more easily environmentally cleared. Largely, if your site is building on an existing built or paved facility already, conducting minimal earth or groundworks, a little minimal earth movement, and primarily installing chargers at an existing site. If that's the case, you are likely to have minimal environmental clearance necessary. Natasha mentioned providing contingent awards and then working with the awarded parties to finalize these environmental clearances. So PennDOT will assist with that process after the award, but you really want to do your due diligence now and on the front end to make sure your site is going to be compliant with all of these NEVI rules and requirements and is best suited also to the PennDOT scoring and evaluation system for their program, which again, there's a host of additional information on the PennDOT NEVI website around this, including that detailed mapping that Jonathan just showed us. So if we jump to the next site or slide, once you've identified your site, coordinating with the utilities is going to be a key component. Obviously, these NEVI compliant charging stations must have 4 ports, each with 150 kilowatts of continuous power for 600 kilowatts of continuous power per site. I've heard others describe this as, citing a new McDonald's or business of that equivalent. So it is a significant amount of commercial power for the utilities to bring. So you will need to coordinate with your utility partners to make sure that there is enough power and service available at that physical site to provide that continuous NEVI minimum required power. If you have any trouble identifying your utility service provider, you can reach out to PennDOT at the email listed. But essentially, you are looking for your distribution utility. You can purchase electrons or the electric energy from energy marketers, but your particular goal is to identify the utility who operates the lines and distribution network in your area and coordinate with them to identify the feasibility of providing that NEVI power and discuss the projected cost and schedule. In most instances, we would expect that the utility will need to drop new transformers directly serving the NEVI charging site, unless there are recently upgraded transformers in that area. So that's both a cost that they will be working with you to quote as part of your application, as well as a schedule implication. What is it going to take for them to just source the transformer and then have the team to be able to install it to make the power available to your specific site? So as noted here, the applicant is expected in PennDOT's process to supply this information to show that sites are already talking to their utilities and have an understanding of the prospective cost and schedule that will be required to make their site power ready for the NEVI charging station. On the next slide, we have an example. PennDOT is working to develop their application materials as we've discussed. This is an example of what PennDOT has begun to develop around what coordination and final information will be required in the application from utilities. You can see on the left-hand side here, they're really asking for physical address and a aerial view of the site. And then on the right-hand side, a cost estimate of the level of service that will need to be, is it existing service, is it upgraded service, is it new service that will need to be supplied at that site, and the ballpark costs for the major components, so that PennDOT has the ability to see that these sites have in fact coordinated with their utilities, do in fact exist in a state of readiness, if funded, to be able to actually install and operate a charging station with that NEVI power requirement. So this is a lot that can be done early so that you've identified your utility, you've begun this conversation, and you're not asking for this at the last minute. Beginning this coordination work, identifying who that utility contact is, developing that relationship, getting this conversation started will benefit you. The sooner you begin that, the better, and then you'll be able to apply more smoothly once the PennDOT NEVI program is released. With that, on the next slide here, we've mentioned this several times, but PennDOT has reached out to all the different utilities listed here and is working to add to its website information on the best practices or guidance issued by each of these utilities and any point of contact for NEVI at each of these distribution utilities. The goal here is to streamline some of the legwork that each of the prospective applicants have to do so that you can log on, see who to contact, and begin that conversation with your utility providers. So with that, I'm going to turn this back over to Natasha, who's going to talk to us about the next steps.
Thank you. You can go to my next slide. So we've had this slide, we've added this a second time in this PowerPoint because we think it's important to just kind of go over this anticipated timeline once again, just to walk through the steps. So just a reminder that we do intend to release our formal notice of funding opportunity, that announcement in late December or early January timeframe. We will have the application period open for approximately 3 months. So anticipating a mid-March timeframe when those applications would be due. A reminder from earlier in the presentation, you will have to go through our e-grant system that we have here at the Commonwealth. So make sure you are preparing yourself by getting that Keystone login in advance to be able to submit those applications. In the mid-May time period, we anticipate making conditional awards with final awards coming out in July. And that will be for the first round of funding. Additionally, as we are announcing the awards for the first round, we'll be opening up the second round of funding around that same time period, making sure that we have plenty of opportunity to fill in the gaps from the alternative fuel corridors, anything that was not filled in round one. There is potential that we might not receive applications for all of the gaps. So having those re-released in round two as we do that. So for each round of funding, proposers will be required to submit an application. So if your proposal was not selected in round one, you are welcome to submit again in round two and round three and round four and additionally. So do not feel if you were not selected in first round that was your only chance. And another reminder, once we build out the alternative fuel corridors, we will have flexibility in our funding for any public roadway, any public space. So those criteria will change as we move forward in future years. Once the projects are installed and operational, there is a NEVI requirement that they are operational for a minimum of 5 years. And during that 5 years, if the final rulemaking says continues to be the way it is now, there will be reporting requirements for those 5 years, as well as operational requirements that everyone must follow. So this, again, illustrative timeline to help you as you are thinking about putting in your proposals, how you can prepare for those. Next slide. I'd also like to take a few minutes to talk about the discretionary funding that is also coming out. So in addition to NEVI funds, we know that in the first year, it's very prescriptive to those alternative fuel corridors. So we want to go over some additional funding opportunities that are forthcoming. And this is a big one here. There's $2.5 billion. This is actually for all alternative fuels, so not just electric vehicle, but also compressed gas, hydrogen, and other alternative fuel sources. This grant or this discretionary program is forthcoming from the federal government. It is our understanding that it is yet to be released. This year yet. I think I said that weird. So make sure as you're thinking about your community needs that you're thinking about this discretionary program. We know through all of the other funding opportunities coming out from the federal government, partnerships is key. Thinking about a regional approach, key partners and stakeholders that you want as part of your application to build a really strong application is important. So make sure you're thinking ahead of what ways that you want to support your community and the charging infrastructure there. Maybe there's opportunities for public parks or libraries or your healthcare systems, different ways that you want to think about mode switch, maybe providing opportunities near transit or bus stops and those types of things as well. So a lot of opportunities to think outside of the box in your neighborhoods and in your communities as you're preparing for this discretionary opportunity as well. So 1.25 billion of this funding is required to support alternative fuel corridors, but 1.25 billion of it will support community charging infrastructure as well. So again, a lot of funding opportunities still coming out from the federal government related to electrification, and this is just one of them. Next slide. This is a chart showing you what's coming out from the DOT, from the US DOT yet. And we have a lot of federal programs that we receive funding for, and some of them have opened up their eligibility to include electric vehicle infrastructure and electric vehicle components, things like planning dollars, things like workforce support. And you can see here kind of on the chart on the right-hand side of your screen, all of the different funding buckets that have come out from the federal government with this new EV eligibility in them. This was part of the NEVI guidelines that were released earlier this year from the federal government. So you can look into that into a little bit more detail. But you can see the chart at the bottom kind of shows you what those funding programs have within them. So some of them are specific to the charging infrastructure. Some do have workforce components. Some are for actual vehicles and fleets, not just on the passenger side, but medium duty, heavy duty transit vehicles. And some are also for planning dollars. So you can look at that chart in more detail in the actual NEVI guidance on the federal government's webpage. There also is a lot of federal tax grants and tax incentives that are coming out. Our Pennsylvania DEP also has a full host of grant programs up on their website. If you've attended any of our stakeholder sessions, we do go into details on those as well. We could drop a link to the DEP grants in the chat if someone can do that, please. And there's also Pennsylvania utilities that are offering some different incentive programs right now that you may be able to take advantage of, some for fleet planning, some for just understanding what opportunities there are for your personal vehicles, for businesses. So check those out as well. So a lot of additional opportunities for funding outside of the NEVI formula program that we've spent most of the presentation talking about. So I think with that, we're at our last slide. There has been a lot of questions coming in through the chat already. We are going to be opening up this time for answering questions. Our team has been documenting the questions kind of behind the scenes, and we're going to try to walk through a lot of the questions that have been asked in the chat. Additionally, now is your chance to put questions in the chat that you may have thought of or have throughout the presentation. We also will be allowing for a hand raising function. If you would like to ask a question live during the session here, you can raise your hand and we will take those as we see them as well and allow for you to be unmuted and ask your question.
Hey, Natasha, I'll start by reading off the questions here that were previously submitted while I see people raise hands and put new questions into the chat. First question was, will each round of funding have separate application process, or is the one in December the only opportunity?
So yes, each round of funding will require a new application submitted for that. So the first funding opportunity is not the only opportunity. And just a reminder, once we build out our alternative fuel corridors, we will be adjusting our plan and approach for spending of the funding to make sure that it is building out our network outside of those alternative fuel corridors. So applications will then come in and be scored differently in future rounds.
Ed asks, are funds available for quote private or use only, or just quote public use?
So all funds must be used in a way that anyone from the general public can use that station. So right now, if you look on our website, we do list potential eligible partners. So some of those are private investments, some of those are public investments, things like libraries, municipal buildings, etc. But everything that uses NEVI funds must be open and accessible to anyone in the general public to use.
Michael asked, and we might need clarification on the intent of this question, would costs related to municipal plan reviews, permitting, and inspection be covered by the grant? I'm not sure if he's asking from the municipality as a way to have cost reimbursement for their roles of performing those, or if they're asking if the awardee, when going through municipal reviews and permitting, would it be acceptable cost. I'm assuming here, I'll jump in for this one, if it's the applicant, the grantee, that would be acceptable costs, we would probably have to get clarification for the municipality. I don't think we've asked that to USDOT about whether or not that is even eligible back to the municipality for their work to be done.
I will say, related to actual planning funds put up separately, on one of our initial slides, we showed the funding availability of the 171. We have some questions in front of the joint office currently related specifically to some planning dollars put aside for different towns and communities and cities to be able to do some overall electrification planning. We are waiting for further guidance and clarification from the joint office on our questions related to that. And if we are eligible to put forth funding for planning, we will release that publicly.
Jim asks, looking for elaboration on cost sharing requirements. Where do non-NEVI utility incentives and various grant programs fit in with respect to the 20% cost share requirement?
Mark, do you want to start with answering that one?
Yeah, so the answer would be for this, and I'm sorry, it's not the best answer. It depends on the specific incentive program. In general, the federal dollars cannot be matched with other federal dollars. Also, we've been explicitly told that if you're using the Volkswagen funds that our partners at DEP have previously utilized and have given out, that also cannot count towards a 20%. But in general, you can use other incentive money as long as it's not federal dollars. You can't match federal dollars with federal. And if you want to email us here offline with specifics on which incentives you or grant programs you were looking at, we could get clarification for you and coordinate with with USDOT and the joint office if we don't have the answer ourselves. The next question is, who will be the owner or owners of the NEVI-funded EV charging stations, and how will the PA Department of Revenue collect alternative fuel tax from every new public-facing EV charging station? That was asked by Nolan.
All right, so we, the DOT, do not intend to own or operate any of the NEVI funded stations. We do intend for them to all be publicly owned or privately owned. The alternative fuel tax is something that someone who is dispensing the electricity is required to pay. We've been working with the Department of Revenue on ways to make sure that this is collected from any new electric vehicle charging stations across the state. And in fact, they are working on an informational mailer now to all current stations that have electric vehicle charging infrastructure to make sure they know and understand their obligations to pay the alternative fuel tax currently in Pennsylvania.
We received a couple questions, including those from Jeff and Brian here about matchmaking, especially as you start to pull together teams. Natasha, I don't know if you want to comment on how we're trying to help out with matchmaking.
Sure. So we are having stakeholder sessions. We've had 5 in the last 2 weeks, and we do have 5 or 6 additional ones coming out. That schedule is on our website. As part of those stakeholder sessions, we have a full networking session that allows people to kind of have opportunity and space to do some of that matchmaking and networking during that time period. We also have done all of those stakeholder sessions in coordination with our utilities. We think it's very important to have upfront and initial conversations with the utility as you're thinking about potential sites and understanding the utility in your area. The utilities have been very good partners in those meetings and have a station during that networking time where you can go up and talk to them about individual projects as well. So I would say that that is a number one focus. We also, as a DOT, are not really allowed to play that matchmaking role ourselves, but we do have our Clean Cities partners who've been very helpful in making sure that if there's opportunities and individuals who need help finding partners and connections, they've been willing and able to help us in that realm.
Great. We received a question here from Brian, and Shane answered it in here, but just for the group, kilowatt requirements based off a charging station or charging plug. And for clarification, NEVI requires each plug to have 150 kilowatts. You have to have a minimum of 4, and with those 4, it has to have simultaneous usage capabilities. So for a total of 600 kilowatts. You can go beyond that, but that is the minimum. You need to at least be 150 per plug, and you have to at least have 4 that can be simultaneously going at 600 kilowatts. We also received a question from Adam about the 1 mile zone and the exceptions, and Gunnar answered it in the chat, but for anyone that didn't see, the federal government is allowing for exemptions. However, it's something you have to file with them, and they would most likely be looking at for that 1 mile exemption to verify that there is no viable options within that mile before they ever go beyond that. So those were in the chat here. We got a couple more coming in. I don't know if you want to switch over to someone who has their hand raised, because I believe they've had to start, and then we'll go back to the chat questions.
Sounds good. Looks like Eric McCrum had his hand up first.
I had a question on the qualifying corridors as built. Once the funding is awarded to a project, do we have guidance yet on whether or not that constitutes like the build out status, particularly for later year funding releases?
So we do have that question formally at the joint office right now. We have asked them to clarify what fully built out means. I use air quotes around that, but making sure we understand if it means fully operational or if the funding has been obligated to those sites and site work has started. We are waiting for further guidance from them on that. it's in my understanding, the last time I spoke to them, it is with their legal team for review. So we are waiting for that guidance to come out.
All right, thank you.
It looks like our next person with their hand up is Kyle Lamb.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
I just wanted to, since you're recording this, wondering if you're going to share all these PowerPoints, because it has a lot of good information on there that I'd like to look over again.
Yes, once this recording has ended, we will be posting all of the slides and the actual recording on our webinar, on our website. So they both will be available, both the PowerPoint and the recording.
Thank you very much.
Additionally, I will mention we chose not to put them in this exact presentation, but as Jamie Kopko had pointed out earlier, we do have a section on our website that has all the utility slides and has all of their contact information and how they would hope that you as a site host, a potential site host, would contact them for understanding the electric needs for your site.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
All right, I think that was the last hand raised, so we'll go back to the questions that were in chat. We have a question here from Evan. I am trying to determine what the line is for what is considered as, quote, directly related to EV stations, end quote. For example, can funds be used to install a solar canopy if some of that power was directed to EV stations, or would that only be eligible if it solely served EV stations? Or would it not be eligible at all?
Mark, I don't know if you or someone from the team wants to start by addressing that one.
So this is one of those ones again, if you have more specifics, we can try and answer them offline, but a lot of these we'll have to go back and get some clarification as we get final rulemaking and some clarification from the joint office. It is our belief that if a lot of this equipment, if the equipment's actually tied back in directly to the EV charging station, so if it was like solar canopy over the EV charging station, and that was then used to go back into the actual system, then yes, that would be an eligible one. If you're doing a solar canopy, say you're at a convenience store or gas station and it's on a different location within the facility, that starts to raise questions, even if it goes back to the EV charging, that we'll probably have to get clarifications from the federal government as well. So if it's right there on site and you're doing things with the actual EV charging station and it ties back in, it'll likely be eligible. Otherwise, we would have to have conversations offline for clarification. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that, Natasha.
No, I think that was good.
All right. Our next question is from Tyler. Will a disadvantaged business enterprise utilization percentage goal be released or required?
So the federal government updated their FAQs about a month or so ago and said that the states are not eligible to apply DBE goals to the NEVI program. We, however, have said that we want to make sure that there's opportunity for different types of businesses to be eligible for this funds. So if you think back to our evaluation criteria, one of the sections talks about equity. And we do have, as part of our evaluation criteria, how small and diverse businesses are thought of in your application and in your partnerships for your site. I don't know if Mark or others want to add to that.
No, I think that was perfect. Our next question is from Roslyn. Will demand charges be an eligible cost on operational costs?
Mark, did you want to start with that or someone else on the team?
I think, I'm trying to remember back here, I believe this is still a question that we have with the joint office for clarification on some components of demand charges. So I don't want to really answer this, and Rosalind, please feel free to email us offline just until we get all answers from the joint office about this, just because there's caveats to everything, and we don't really want to have go on record one way or another until we get complete clarification. So Unfortunately, this is one that we are going to have to defer until we get additional information, but feel free to email out to the team and we can follow up. And once we get clarification, we will be posting everything in our FAQs online so that everyone will see those responses. But unfortunately, I don't think we can answer that right now. Next question is from Tomas, and it's, what are the requirements for an AFC to have redundancy?
So if I'm reading the question correctly or hearing the question correctly, I think it's asking about redundancy on the alternative fuel corridors. So in the Pennsylvania plan, our NEVI plan, we have stated that we want to add redundancy into the system, making sure again that we have a consistent network across our state. So our goal is to have stations every 25 miles. So going into further redundancy beyond the 50-mile requirement of the federal government. So we will be looking at redundancy as we are doing site selection. We also know that as more electric vehicles come onto the market, similar to today where there's more than one gas station off an exit, having additional options off an exit for more than one EV charging infrastructure off that site is also welcome. So we will be using that as part of our evaluation as we add redundancy into the system. I would say our polygons and our interactive map also shows you kind of that priority.
All right, our next question is from Brian. Funding ranges from Class 2 to Class 8, yes. No exclusions on EV vehicles or trucks. So Class 2 being passenger vehicles, and then Class 8 ranging to a 4-axle single trailer, typically, for anyone who's not familiar with the classes here. Natasha, do you want to take that, or do you want me to take that?
You can start, Mark, and I can fill in.
Yeah, so yes, it's open. The dominant focus here is traditionally on the passenger vehicle, so more of a Class 2. But we will be looking at abilities here. You saw a slide in there about future proofing and looking towards medium and heavy duty. We know that there will be additional guidance coming out from the federal government here on medium and heavy duty vehicles in the future, and probably some additional funding mechanisms for that. But we don't want to necessarily lose sight of that altogether and only focus on passenger vehicles. We know passenger vehicles is the predominant focus, but we still want to have considerations for other classes of vehicles.
Thank you, Mark.
Our next question is from Aaron. What if the station doesn't meet the uptime percentage requirement? Is there a penalty or payment required by owner/operator/applicant?
So I think this is another question that we kind of have up to the joint office for some clarity right now. We also do hope to have our contract language have some I don't know the legal term, guarantees in it as we put forth the funding. But I think this is one of the ones that we are hoping the joint office will provide some additional clarity on what happens if that uptime requirement is not met.
Our next question is Harold. If selected for the program, would this be a revenue generating opportunity for the owners of the station? If so, are there any examples of the profitability of the business?
So the NEVI guidelines do say currently that the owner of an EV station is eligible to take a reasonable rate of return for the station. So it can be a revenue generator for a business to have an EV charging site.
Our next question is from James. It says, earlier you mentioned program management of the PennDOT NEVI program. Who are your program management team members, firms, James? For James here, predominantly we're focusing, we have, of course, a core team here within PennDOT ranging in a variety of areas. But on top of that, we have competitively procured consulting support. It is a broad team with expertise in a variety of areas to help out with things from design to construction to environmental evaluation reviews to grant program assistance and a variety of other things. HNTB is the prime on that open-end agreement that we've competitively procured. Next question is from Paula, and it's how soon will funding be issued to recipients?
So use of the federal funds is a reimbursement program. So when we release the funding and pick our applicants, they will have to then submit in invoices to be reimbursed for the expenses that have been paid out. And there's a process for that and timeline rules that we follow for procurement. And I don't know if there's other details, Mark, or others want to add to that.
No, I think our general stance is our goal is to try and do it as quick as possible, knowing we are still a state agency. There is a lot of I's that need to be dotted and T's that need to be crossed, but it is the goal of the department to try and expedite the process as much as possible. Our next question here is from Rosalind, and will there be an in-person or virtual meeting after the RFP is released?
I'd say that's a great question. I don't know that we have one scheduled yet to talk through the procurement once it's out or have an open time period for questions, but that is something our team can consider. I will say that starting next spring, we will be doing community engagement and hope to go out in person to different communities across the state as we think about the electrification needs of different communities and how they differ. So there will be some additional in-person meetings related to community engagement, but on the actual funding opportunity, that's something our team has to discuss.
Our next question is from Carla, and it says, we are located in the PA Wilds. Per the discussion, it appears that area is not an area of focus at this point. Is there a timeline for any of the more remote areas? So I'm assuming this is discussing remote areas outside of the AFCs that go through some of our rural locations. Natasha, do you want to take that one?
Sure, I can start. So I think if you think back to kind of the last slide I talked about, or one of the last two slides, outside of the NEVI funds, there is some additional funding opportunities outside of those AFC networks. So if you are a potential site host or a potential location that doesn't have an alternative fuel corridor running through you, don't feel like there's no opportunities for you now. There's definitely some DEP funding grants that are open right now. There's also the discretionary grant program that's coming out. We feel now that alternative fuel corridors can be built out potentially in the first 2 years. So hopefully, as soon as we have those built out, there will be this additional flexibility for other public roadways and other public spaces with our funds. But at this time, the NEVI funds really, because of the federal rules, have to go to the AFC network.
Can I jump in really quick, Natasha and Mark? This is John. Just another bit to that question, Carla. We do have, again, after Natasha said those 2 years, we're trying to get those through quick so we can get to areas like the ones you're discussing. We have the EV mobility plan also linked on the website, which kind of goes into more broad details on what PennDOT's looking into for building out what we call routes of significance. For instance, US Route 6, 219, and some of the other state highways in the areas you mentioned are on that. So I encourage you to look at that plan to see kind of what's coming up in the next couple of years, in addition to what Natasha also mentioned is what's available now.
So our next question is from Olivia, and she said, can you please clarify, did you just say that federal guidance prohibits states from applying DBE scoring preference to the NEVI funds?
I was trying to find it quickly on the website, but I was not fast enough. But maybe someone from my team can put the link to the federal NEVI FAQs in the chat. It's something we can share more widely. But the federal FAQ does say that states are not allowed to set DBE goals for the NEVI program.
And also, nor are the feds going to set goals.
Correct.
So I guess adding on, to the best of our knowledge, we can add a point if you have a diverse team, but we can't set goals, nor will the feds have goals, which is kind of a contrast to what we're used to with DOT type of funded projects. We understand it's surprising to people as well. Our next question is from Emmerich. Please clarify the size requirements previously stated as 150 kilowatts per plug simultaneously, so 600 kilowatts per station. Yes, if there's, the NEVI requirement, you have to have at least 4. And with those 4, it's all based around a base requirement, a minimum requirement. It is 150 kilowatts per plug. Simultaneously, all 4 have to be able to be utilized. So for a total of 600 kilowatts. There's not cost or power sharing where you could have one of the plugs doing 100 kilowatts and then utilize additional wattage there and say have another plug going 200 kilowatts. They all have to be a minimum 150 kilowatts coming out of the end of the plug, going into the vehicle, with 4 of them simultaneously operating with the set requirement uptime the feds have identified.
When we post our final webinar, we can add a slide. We actually have it in some other presentations we've given, but we have some slides that talk about the federal guidelines in these requirements. So we can add those into the final version that gets posted on our website to make sure that there's additional clarity on what is required for a NEVI compliant station.
All right. Our next question is from Eric. How are updates to directional signing on public roadways to direct the traveling public to available facilities anticipated to be handled?
All right, Mark, did you want to start with that one, or I can?
Sure. So there's 2 types of signage. Of course, there's the wayfinding signage, and then there's the signage at the site. Both signage have to be MUTCD compliant, the Manual for Uniform Traffic Control Devices. It's a federal guidelines that are directly adopted by every state or indirectly adopted through their own regs, basically pointing to it. And Pennsylvania included, so they'll have to be compliant with that. We are currently discussing with the Joint Office about the wayfinding. So from the actual roadway to the site, more of those like blue directional signage that people are traditionally used to. With that, we are looking to see that if PennDOT can actually do those installations, then have our crews that install them be reimbursed. We do have our own sign shops here as part of the department, so it's easier enough for us to do that. If you're talking about those signs where you see the listing of businesses at the exits, that is handled through a trust. Is it a trust, Natasha, that does
Sign
that?
trust.
Thank you. The sign trust. They verify things. You can already get an EV placard put onto your title, no different. You can do a diesel right now going through that, so that's still a possibility. And then on site, that would be the recipient of the grant who would be responsible for the on-site signage. But the actual wayfinding to that in compliance with the federal requirements, we are looking to see if Pennsylvania can do that. And we're looking at that from a variety of rationales behind that, but that might be the easiest. We got some people who just asked, thank you for a clarification and comment. Roslyn, can you please clarify Justice 40 areas? Is there a certain mileage from a Justice 40 area, 5 miles, 10 miles, that will still be considered as impacting part of the Justice 40 area? So if it's not in it, but it's near it, do we have clarification on that?
So we've been talking about the Justice 40 initiative. And for those who are unfamiliar, the Justice 40 initiative relates not just to the NEVI program, but to some of the other IIJA funded programs. States that 40% of the benefits of the funding must go to the Justice 40 areas. We have done some mapping for our disadvantaged communities, for our EJ, environmental justice communities, and we actually have a team that's looking at, from that perspective, where our corridors help fill those gaps and how they can help benefit specific communities with that. I'm not familiar with a certain mileage requirement from the Justice 40. That's something we can look into. But we are making sure that our investments will meet the Justice 40 requirements throughout the 5 years of our NEVI program. I don't know, Jonathan or Andrew, do we have the mapping of those on our interactive map?
So they're not on the interactive map right now, but we have, there's a few resources we could share. If I can find it right away, I'll put it in the chat here, where you could look at the mapping. There's also, we have been, in discussing all the interchange scoring that Natasha talked about before, we have talked about that very fact of, within the Justice 40 area itself, and then also, 5-10 miles were numbers we were throwing around as far as what we might use to incentivize even within the AFC build out. So when the final scoring comes out, definitely look for that, but certainly been part of the discussion. I'll see if I can share the map with you. It's not currently on our map. It may be at the final announcement.
Thanks, Jonathan.
So Emmerich posted again here, please clarify the size requirements previously stated as 150 kilowatts per plug simultaneously, so 600 kilowatts per station. 150 kilowatts plug means a 625 amp at 240 volts or 1250 amp at 120 volts, which is not practical for charging a vehicle. So the 150 kilowatts per plug with a simultaneous 600 kilowatts per station is a federal requirement, not by PennDOT. This is explicit within NEVI initial guidance, continue on to the rulemaking. This is where the federal government has ended up at, and that has to meet that minimum requirements. You can exceed that, and that would go into any type of evaluation we do, but at a minimum, it must meet that. Next question. From Andrew, I have a location residing just 0.2 miles outside of one of the polygons on the interactive map. Will this location be eligible for consideration, or is there a hard and fast rule that locations must be within one of these pre-established polygons for consideration for the round 1 funding? So 0.2 miles outside of the 1 mile. Natasha, you want to tackle that one, or?
Sure, I can start. So I will say that in our current EV stations that we have, I'm just going to take a step back. In the federal government AFC corridor program, in prior rounds, they actually had that you had to be within 5 miles of an interstate interchange. So in our initial stations that we had that were compliant to that program, we also have some stations that currently exist that are more than 1 mile from the interstate interchange. And in fact, we have some that are 1.2, 1.3. We have some that are closer to 3 or 4 miles off the interstate. And some of those locations might be ones that in the future we would ask for an exemption or exception request. But I think we're waiting to see if there is stations that are viable within that 1 mile. So I would say if you have a location and you're really interested, apply. I don't know, my team might say differently because maybe you're the only viable station in that area, and might be one that we would have to ask for an exemption request for as well. So I don't know, Mark, if you think differently or have other thoughts on that, but I know that we already have some stations that are existing off the AFC's 1.2, 1.3 miles. That are not currently NEVI compliant because of that mile distance.
I agree.
Just really quick to add to, as I mentioned when I showed the map, if you're in that case where you're really close and you're not sure, there are cases, for example, where the 1 mile might split a parking lot or things like that. So it's definitely worth asking us if you're within that like 0.1, 0.2 miles to take a look at your particular area and see if we think you're eligible or not. The 1 mile polygons, they were vetted very well, but there is still not, the federal government still could clarify even further. So for instance, we did them 1 mile off of the end of the interchange ramp to try and give you as much distance as possible. But, and that's a debatable question as well. So if you're close, ask. So please, Andrew, if you have the exact location, just let us know and we can look at it.
Agree.
Our next question is from Doug. Is the PA NEVI open to any EV charging manufacturer, or is there a selected list already? The answer is right now we don't have a qualified products listing. We're getting clarification internal if we need to have that. If so, we will make sure everyone is aware of that. With that, it's pretty straightforward. You just have to basically give us a cut sheet that shows that you meet the requirements. It will be all based around what's already in the federal requirements here for charging per plug and overall charging rate and things that line up with that. And it's a pretty straightforward process to just get on the name. It's nothing very complex for that, but right now we don't have that. We're not sure if it is necessary, but we're working through that right now in parallel to determine if it is, and we will make sure that it's well known if so that all charging manufacturers and equipment suppliers can get onto that list. Brian says, if we are running 150 kilowatts per plug, if we are dual charging, this is the 350 kilowatt charger. These are large and very expensive. I guess we understand it. Time back, we're just lining up with the federal requirements here. Brian says the program's so well thought out. Congrats to the PennDOT team for your strategic approach. Thank you very much. Jason asks, is there an updated map of existing EV stations to help determine potential upgrading of those sites?
So I would say yes. We actually have two interactive maps right now. On our main EV page, we have an interactive map that shows all of the current stations, EV stations across the state. It's showing you everything from level 2, Tesla and DC fast charging stations. You can actually click on the link to any of those stations. It can also show you a street view of the site. Tells you all the details, what type of charger is there. And it does show you on that map, and maybe the team can throw that link in the chat. It does show you which ones are currently NEVI compliant and which ones are not NEVI compliant, I guess, on that map. So that is available currently on our website. Jonathan, I'm going to go back to you on the other one. Is our NEVI polygon map, does it show where there's stations currently?
The NEVI polygon map only shows the current either fully NEVI compliant stations or the ones that have been let through other programs that will be fully NEVI compliant. It does not show the other stations. So I would refer to the other map Natasha's mentioning. We can link that in there.
Okay. And Jason, if you have a specific site that you own or operate and you want us to check and see if it's a current EV site that could be upgraded, you're welcome to email us that detail and we can look at that for you.
Our next question is from Mark. Can you clarify the trust for directional signage? So what we're talking about is the PA Tourism signing trust. So you might have seen these, exit signs are big blue, basically have the logos for companies that are off that exit. You pay to have it there, so they'll have it for lodging, they'll have it for restaurants, they'll have it for fueling. There is a program through the logo program. With that, you can actually then purchase directional, or you can purchase a spot on that sign so you can advertise that your business is off of that exit. And with that, you can then incorporate for fueling an ability to note that you have EV charging. Next question is, will your scoring allow for future proofing of chargers from 150 kilowatts to 350 kilowatts or higher for medium heavy duty vehicle charging? And the answer is we do have a future proofing component, as was noted earlier here by Natasha. and that will go into the overall scoring consideration. Brian says lead times are extreme, 52 weeks on some of the more powerful 300 kilowatt chargers. Do we have a time limit for funding?
So I would say our team is still working through kind of the framework of our funding once we release it. I know some programs only have or have a certain strict timeline of when the funds must be used. Overall, NEVI funding is something that once we, the state, have received it, we don't lose it. Currently, it's kind of a rolling bucket of money. But as we put out our procurement, we may put some rules around it of when we hope people will have the charging infrastructure installed. But we know currently in our risks and challenges section of our NEVI plan, we do talk about this. We know that supply chain is an issue. We know that Buy America potentially might make that that timeline a little more complicated as well. But we haven't come up or formulated our final rules around how long it will take. And maybe we would have an exemption process, if things are taking longer due to unforeseen circumstances.
All right. Rosalind asks, for the 1 mile off the AFCs, would that be driving distance to the chargers? I guess driving versus just an aerial, as the crow flies, 1 mile.
So
I can take that one
go
if
ahead,
you want,
Jonathan.
Natasha. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yes, it is driving distance, not as the crow flies.
Christina asks, if we attended this call, will we automatically receive updates that are posted on the website?
I will let Jamie unmute maybe and answer that.
There's actually on the screen a survey. And so if you're interested, by all means, if you could take that survey and let me know, because we do have to ask permission to have your email. I will say, however, that after this presentation, when I post the presentation and recording on the website, I will do the courtesy of emailing everyone that has registered and attended to let you know where to find this information. So if you want to respond back to me at that point to just say add us to the stakeholder database, I'm happy to do it then as well.
All right. Mike just wanted to note, brilliant job, PennDOT. Very specific NEVI plan, dynamic map, and great presentation today. Very good government. Thank you. Well, thank you. Next, we have Ned says, can you navigate the EPA site and show what filters to apply versus the PA state map?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. Is that our interactive map? How to add those layers?
So he may be asking, because I had shared also the resource, those that asked about environmental justice areas. I shared 2 resources for that. One was the EV mobility plan, which has static maps of what are considered the actual environmental justice areas for the corridors, which are the ones we're using as part of the plan. The EPA I threw on there as an additional. There are many indicators on there. I would say none of which are directly related to NEVI. So if you go there, you'll see a bunch of different indicators about environmental justice concerns, socioeconomic indicators, service gaps like food deserts and things. Those are kind of more for your interest. They're not things that would necessarily tie directly into the scoring. So I'm not sure if it would make sense to go through that, but I think that might have been what the question was referring to.
It was, thank you.
Our next question is driving distance to the chargers as opposed to the driving distance to the entrance to the facility. I think it's, I'll take a bold assumption here and I'll make the statement here for the group. We are going to go to the facility. We're not going to dive down in and try and figure out the distance from the entrance to the actual charger when you get on site. We are just going to be going to the facility, and I believe the feds would agree with that.
Yeah, no, sorry.
The other thing I'll note, sorry, Jonathan, the other thing I'll note too is, you know, when we're looking at the 1 mile distance, think about an interchange and how there might be an eastbound or a westbound or a north or southbound exit off the interstate. We are taking it from the closest one. So if you are a northbound roadway, maybe it's 1 mile to it, but if you're on the southbound, it's 1.2. It's taking whichever one is closest, whichever intersection to the interstate for that 1 mile polygon. And Jonathan, clarify if I said that incorrectly.
No, that was perfect, Natasha. All I was going to add to it was that there are definitely cases, and we could have been here until 2026 if we wanted to actually make sure every polygon, you know, perfectly went around every parking lot, especially, you know, when you build new parking lots at your site. So I would say if you're, as Mark mentioned, if your site is on there, if it's covered at all and half your parking lot's not there, but half is, that I would say that's included by default. But if you do have questions, just let us know. And as Natasha said, we try to be as open as possible and go give the best distance. So.
All right, we got some more kudos here for Natasha and Jamie and the rest of the team. Thank you everyone for the compliments here. Tyler asks, how many NEVI sites does PennDOT plan to fund here throughout the state for the first year of funding? Also, will PennDOT's fiscal year 22 and fiscal year 23 NEVI fundings be combined into the first year of funding as PennDOT, as the DOT has previously stated in press releases?
Yes, so the federal fiscal year 2023, which just started on October 1st of this year, we did just receive, I think a week or two ago, our funding allocation from the federal government. So we do now have access to both federal fiscal year 22 and 23 funding. That funding will be used as we build out the alternative fuel corridors that I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, I can't add quick enough, around 56 million approximately for both years worth of funding for the initial build out. That funding, we do believe we can build out our AFCs potentially with that first 2 years worth of money. Right, oh, thank you so much. Right now, we anticipate, I'm gonna do an approximation, 40 to 50 sites to be NEVI compliant. The reason it's a range is some of our interstates intersect with other interstates. So depending where a NEVI station is installed, it could potentially build out a station for more than one interstate and make it AFC compliant or NEVI compliant. So we don't have an exact number. Right now, it's just a guesstimate based on where all of the locations are. But I think I've answered all of those questions. Yeah, here. Yeah, approximately 56 million.
And it looks like what we have left in the chat is just more kudos here for the team.
All right, I'll do a final wrap up then. Everyone, we appreciate your time. I've seen over 300 people on this webinar at one time, so a lot of great participation, a lot of good questions coming in. If you think of anything after this recording has stopped, you're welcome to email it to the site or the email resource account you're seeing on the final screen here. It is our resource account. Our team does manage this resource account every day and answer questions. Additionally, if you can, we would appreciate your feedback on this session. There's a QR code here on the screen you can use to open up our survey. You can also ask to be added to our mailing list for future NEVI announcements or EV related announcements. Again, thank you to our full team for helping answer questions and putting together today's PowerPoint presentation. And thank you to all of you who are interested in being partners with us as we roll out our NEVI formula funds. Thank you and have a great day.